Bienvenidos, gracias por su asistencia a la Masterclass International Political Dimensions of the Global Crisis impartida por el Dr. Gabriel Aguilera. Me gustaría platicarles un poquito más acerca del Dr. Gabriel Aguilera. Él es el decano de la región norte de la Escuela de Ciencias Sociales y Gobierno en el Tecnológico de Monterrey. Es doctor y maestro en Ciencia Política por la Universidad de Harvard, maestro en Asuntos Internacionales por la Escuela de Política y Estrategia Global de la Universidad de California en San Diego, y es licenciado en Ciencia Política por la Universidad de Stanford. Desde julio de 2011 formó parte de la Facultad de Seguridad Internacional en el United States Airworld College, donde impartió clases y conferencias sobre política exterior de Estados Unidos, seguridad global, economía política internacional y estudios latinoamericanos. Dirigió la Cátedra de Seguridad Nacional y Toma de Decisiones de los Estados Unidos durante 5 años y desde 2015 encabezó los programas de desarrollo de instructores militares de su departamento. Antes de asumir ese cargo, fue profesor asistente y director de la carrera de Relaciones Internacionales en el Departamento de Ciencia Política en la Estatal de California, investigador visitante en la Claremont Institute for Economic Policy Studies y profesor visitante en el Departamento de Ciencia Política del Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. Muchas gracias, Gabe, por facilitarnos esta conferencia tan interesante. Les quiero platicar que tendremos un espacio al final de esta conferencia para preguntas. Estas las pueden realizar en cualquier momento por el chat. Nosotros las estaremos recopilando y presentando al conferencista. Sin más, me gustaría pasarle la palabra al Dr. Gabriel Aguilera para iniciar esta conferencia. Bienvenidos.
Thank you very much, Susana. I hope everyone can hear me well from their living rooms or from their kitchen tables or wherever you might find yourself today. Before anything else, I would just like to say thank you to the Tec de Monterrey, to the School of Social Sciences and Government, led by Dr. Alejandro Poré, for the opportunity to have an opportunity to speak with all of you today about the international political dimensions of the global crisis. The presentation is planned for about 45 minutes, which should leave plenty of time for questions and answers afterward. But let me go ahead and jump right to the substance without too much more preamble. Once again, thank you all for being here. We have all been reading for weeks now about the tragic health consequences of COVID-19, about how it is bringing the global economy to its knees. The IMF has confirmed that this economic downturn is the steepest since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Each of these catastrophes on its own is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Epidemiologists have noted that we have not seen anything on the scale of COVID-19 since the Spanish flu of 1918. There's great uncertainty as to when COVID-19 will be under control and when we can return to a life that resembles normal. The worst case scenarios foresee years of economic recovery before the advanced industrialized countries get back to economic levels resembling those of just a few weeks ago, which to us seem like months ago. Developing countries around the world, like Mexico and Brazil and many others, face an even tougher and more difficult climb. Predicting the social and political consequences of a worst-case scenario is treacherous work. So by global crisis, therefore, I am referring to the combined effects of the pandemic as well as the economic collapse. As the title of this presentation indicates, my goal today is to talk with all of you about the international political consequences of this crisis. Students of international relations are debating what impact this crisis will have on international politics. The optimists argue that the crisis may eventually spark opportunities for increased global cooperation toward solutions to grave problems like pandemics, global warming, and income inequality. Pessimists are asserting that we may be at a critical juncture that will put the world on a different and much more dangerous path, one that will deepen existing cracks in international politics, that will lead to more conflict and uncertainty in world affairs. My own tentative view that I'm sharing today is actually one of cautious optimism. There are good reasons to believe that the world will be more conflictual and dangerous, but my analysis is that this will be so only in the short run. The medium run prospects are uncertain, of course, and they will be a function of the depth of the crisis as well as electoral outcomes in the democratic world, particularly in the United States. This is so because in recent years, the US has been one of the biggest sources of discord and conflict in global affairs. This is a travesty because it is not hard to imagine better circumstances during this crisis with competent and decent leadership in Washington. So in the time I have today, I'm going to be making two arguments. The first is that the crisis will reinforce the major geopolitical rivalries that have surfaced in recent years. However, I am not convinced that these will rise to unusually dangerous levels during the crisis. The sources of the most problematic geopolitical rivalries have three main features today. The first is China's emergence as an economic powerhouse, a process that begins in the early 1990s. The upshot is that this development has raised tensions in North and Southeast Asia, the most important issue being Taiwan, which China hopes to reincorporate one day. The second is Russia's resurgence as a global power under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, beginning in the 1990s. He is menacing his neighbors, former members of the Soviet bloc. Several now are members of NATO, and others are aspiring members, which creates great tensions in Eastern Europe. The third element is that the United States became much more risk-taking and unpredictable after the attacks of September 11, 2001. The costly and unnecessary second war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and the Cold War that is brewing with Iran have produced great uncertainty in that part of the world. The Obama administration mitigated some of the damage in the region by warming relations with Iran to a degree, but the Trump administration has undermined the nuclear accord and resumed that Cold War, much to the delight of Israel as well as several Arab states. With this said, I do not expect these rivalries to rise to dangerous levels during the crisis, for reasons that will become clear. My sense is that the risk of major violence between states will remain within the parameters that we have been living with. I do, however, expect relations with China. I expect these to get more difficult in the months ahead for reasons that I'll explain in a little bit. The second argument is this. The outcome of the US election will tell us a great deal whether international cooperation will improve beyond the short run. The crisis will have a deep and lasting impact on domestic political coalitions in democracies everywhere, and in the United States in particular. Simply stated, my bet is that bad governance with respect to the pandemic, combined with economic hardship, will be just enough in key battleground states for Joseph Biden to win the US elections. Trump's exit from the presidency would be an extremely positive signal for international cooperation. Remember that when the second Bush administration left office, the world cheered. Poor President Obama, embarrassed at the time, had to accept a Nobel Prize just after taking office for, and I quote, for his extraordinary efforts to strengthen international diplomacy and cooperation between peoples. This is worth mentioning because President Biden was one of President Obama's closest advisors who assisted him throughout the crisis of 2008 and 2009, both with respect to domestic as well as international affairs. So the goal of my presentation today is not only to develop these arguments, but also to make explicit the conceptual framework that I use for analysis. It consists of a set of conceptual lenses or propositions, if you will, that are shaping my analysis of contemporary international politics. These put a focus on how I interpret available facts that are relevant to these arguments. These four lenses, by the way, do not represent my personal desires or hopes of how I would like to see world affairs function, at least not too much. Rather, I am making explicit my underlying analytical assumptions of how I try to understand state behavior in international politics. The first of these is the following. Other things being equal, states strive to increase their power in international affairs. That's the first one. Now, this is true of all states, and they do this to survive and to thrive to the best of their abilities in the international arena. States seek to strengthen one or more of three primary instruments of power: military capabilities, economic prosperity, as well as prestige. And by prestige, I am referring to what some call soft power, which broadly speaking has its roots in states' abilities to summon and deploy their tangible and intangible cultural and economic resources to influence other actors. Now, states, of course, will seek to strengthen one or more of these, but not necessarily all three, depending on their size, their geographic location, as well as other factors. It is not an accident, for example, that Mexico spends comparatively little on its military. There is little it can do militarily to thwart the Goliath of the North, and it does not face other major external state threats. The second proposition is the following. Other things being equal, politicians will privilege domestic political priorities over international ones. In other words, politicians will do whatever it takes to secure political power at home first, even if it means sacrificing their political influence abroad. This is true whether we are talking about democratic, authoritarian, or hybrid regimes. Students of international relations will notice right away that these first two propositions draw clearly on realist political thought. Analytically, realism stresses the centrality of the state and the struggle for political power within states. It asserts that political life is intrinsically conflictual, even violent, due to the imperfect nature of human beings. International life occurs in a state of anarchy, one without an authority who can enforce international laws and norms. Peace and stability, according to realists, results from balances of power between states. Peace, for realists, is never permanent, and this explains why states are always attempting to expand one or more of their instruments of power. Of course, some of the great thinkers of the realist school include the Greek historian Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Thomas Hobbes. I want to emphasize that for the purposes of political analysis, the second proposition dominates the first in this framework. Yes, states in international affairs are striving for political power, pursuing some combination of the three instruments that I mentioned. I assume, however, that politicians will privilege their political struggles at home, particularly when these are challenged by forceful newcomers, either at the ballot box or by way of political intrigue in authoritarian regimes. The next two propositions draw more on liberal thought than on political realism. Liberalism, in contrast to realism, stresses the importance of civil society and social actors, economic interdependence, formal and informal political institutions, as well as norms and ideas. Liberals see peace and stability resulting from diplomacy and cooperation. Wars are a product of misunderstandings, illiberal regimes, and imperfect information. Liberalism, in contrast to realism, has a progressive view of human nature. History is on the march towards a better world because human beings are improving as a function of good laws, international institutions, economic interdependence, as well as the spread of democracy. The great liberal philosopher Immanuel Kant, for example, envisioned a perpetual peace organized by a confederation of democratic states. This stands in sharp contrast to Machiavelli and Hobbes, who envision a world of never-ending conflict and violence. They, therefore, emphasize the need for unrelenting state power as well as virtuous princes. Liberals want to see the spread of democracy and markets, and they frown on Machiavellian princes. So as I said, the next two propositions draw to a degree on liberal insights, whereas the first two are realist in their scope. So number 3 is the following. Other things being equal, international institutions constrain the raw struggle of power between states in the international arena. By institutions, I am referring to international intergovernmental organizations, as well as non-governmental organizations, such as the United Nations or Doctors Without Borders, respectively. Institutions can be formal laws and regulations, as well as informal norms, habits, and ideas that shape how states interact with one another. If the first two lenses emphasize the struggle for power, this third one asserts that states do not operate in a vacuum in international affairs. The struggle for power is mitigated by the strong currents flowing from these institutions. States and politicians must navigate these when they interact with one another in international affairs. Today's most important intergovernmental institutions include, among many others, the United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the European Union, the Group of 20, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the many alliances, military alliances, as well as commercial arrangements that states have constructed since World War II and have deepened since the early 1990s. Many of these have increased in stature and influence with the backing of powerful states, including China and Russia. Aside from these intergovernmental organizations, there's also the connective tissue of international cooperation that happens between governments at the bureaucratic level, to include militaries, health officials, central bankers, financial regulatory authorities, firefighters, and many, many more. There are also now tens of thousands of non-governmental international organizations such as think tanks, universities, myriads of professional organizations, as well as countless multinational corporations and business firms of every size. International institutions, in short, blanket the globe and cushion the power struggle between states like never before in world history. The next and final proposition builds on number 3. Other things being equal, states today are highly averse to engaging in interstate wars. There are at present several significant factors that are constraining interstate war. The spread of democracy, economic interdependence, humanity's terrible dread of nuclear conflict, and international institutions all contribute towards reducing this risk. In particular, I want to call attention to America's military alliances in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia that attempt to balance the territorial ambitions of the dominant regional powers, respectively Russia, Iran, and China. Add to this that US military capabilities, together with those of its wealthy partners in those regions, also work to deter major interstate conflict. Certainly, the United States could not match Russian or Chinese manpower advantages in Europe or Asia, but it has successfully deterred attacks against its friends and allies, and the US has the reservoirs of power to continue doing so. To its far west, Russia has rich and powerful neighbors backed by US military muscle, its commitment sealed by NATO. China has 3 rich and powerful neighbors with deep ties to the US and the history of bad blood between them. It is easy to forget that Japan remains a mighty power in its own right in that part of the world. Although China's military muscle has increased in recent years, it is still a ways from being able to match US air and sea power. On another front, economic globalization is tamping down risk to interstate war. Since the early 1990s, globalization has generated levels of economic interdependence never before seen that has produced immense wealth all over the world and has lifted an estimated 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. During these years, the incomes of the extremely rich grew dramatically and the middle classes were somewhat squeezed. Harvard economist Danny Roderick has tagged this period as the era of hyperglobalization, the quarter century during which China's GDP in purchasing power parity terms surpassed that of the United States in aggregate size. Today, powerful coalitions of socioeconomic groups who have benefited immensely from globalization have the resources to pressure governments against resorting to costly wars to achieve political ends. Of course, globalization has slowed down considerably during the crisis, but it should recover even if it does not do so fully. And both China and Russia, albeit in very different ways, are heavily dependent on the global economy. Finally, scholars have underscored that democratic states are less likely to go to war with each other. Rivers of ink have been spilled on the subject, and we are still somewhat uncertain of the precise mechanisms for this outcome. What we do know is that the US has maintained deep diplomatic, economic, and military ties with the wealthy democracies in Asia and Europe. These include many of the wealthiest and most powerful countries on earth. Citizens in these countries share an affinity for liberty, freedom of the press, markets, free elections, and international institutions. It is easy to forget that the democratic centers of modern globalization in Western Europe and Northeast Asia blossomed under America's military umbrella during the Cold War, while the US provided relatively open market access to these actors. Russia and China, of course, maintain important economic ties with these nations, as well as diplomatic ties, but they do not possess the prestige and special relationship with them as does the United States. That they share common liberal values is surely part of the story why we are not worrying today about wars between democracies, but rather between democracies and non-democracies. This brings me to point out where the risk of major interstate war exists today, where it is very real. The Middle East has been a big ongoing worry due to the massive strategic blunder of the second Bush administration that went to war against Iraq without much of a political strategy. This much is well known and accepted now. This decision deeply upset the balance of power in the region and therefore remains a dangerous and incredibly risky part of the world, particularly since President Trump undid much of the process made by the Obama administration in reducing tensions with Iran. This has emboldened Arab and Israeli efforts to bring Iran to heel. It is not coincidental that among the main protagonists at each other's throats within that region, only Israel is democratic. Let me now turn to the arguments in light of the analytic propositions that I just discussed. These that I've just discussed, sketch a contemporary international order where conflict and cooperation between states is mediated by institutions and constrained by politicians attempting to maintain political power at home, either by winning elections or via authoritarian instruments and coercion. So the first argument I'm making asserts that the crisis will reinforce the major geopolitical rivalries that have surfaced in recent years. The crisis certainly is doing just this with respect to the rivalry between the US and China, perhaps the world's most important in the coming decades, if not century. The crisis has exposed their pursuit of power at home and abroad at the expense of each other, and this rift should intensify in the months ahead for reasons that I will explain. China, after its reprehensible mismanagement of the epidemic when it first erupted last year, has been attempting to assume the role of global leader during the pandemic in order to enhance its prestige internationally and to impress upon countries that its model of governance is excellent and worthy of emulation. It has delivered medical supplies to countries in Europe and Africa. It can do so, of course, because of its awesome manufacturing capabilities in the areas of medical equipment and supplies, as well as pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, it has also managed to get in its own way while executing its strategy for two reasons. The first is that China is new at the business of global leadership. It simply does not have the experience and reservoirs of trust and goodwill from having been a successful leader in the past. Democratic states, moreover, are deeply skeptical because it is an authoritarian state, after all. The second is that Chinese foreign policy is intricately linked to propaganda at home, which the government tightly controls. This is an important instrument for the Chinese government in order to shore up domestic political power, but very hard to wield when the government is trumpeting every mission and begging acknowledgement, and even in some cases, subservience from those it is supposedly helping. It has undiplomatically bragged about how well it has managed the crisis, comparing its success to efforts in the West in false and disdainful messaging that has led to harsh criticism by countries in Europe and Africa, both important recipients of Chinese assistance. The hardest hit countries, of course, will not easily forget China's mishandling of the epidemic. Some in the Chinese government have even encouraged propaganda accusing the US military of triggering the outbreak, using this and other fake news to fan nationalism and xenophobia at home, both of which have been harshly criticized by other countries. These efforts, however, are also useful, as I said, for shoring up political support at home for the Chinese regime. The US federal government, which has for its part failed miserably to lead an effective national response to the crisis in the US, has gone on the offensive to scapegoat China, and for that matter, anyone that seems to be a good target. It has referred to the COVID-19 epidemic as a Chinese virus that seems to be fueling conspiracy theories that China launched the disease on purpose. Last week, the US even stopped funding the World Health Organization, falsely accusing it of having played a role in covering up the outbreak in China. For the Trump administration, the World Health Organization was too cozy with China. Both the United States and China have to varying degrees disgraced themselves in the international arena during the crisis. The US response has been particularly counterproductive because in singling out China, it is actively undermining global cooperation efforts that need China to succeed. Overall, China has been a much more constructive player throughout the fiasco. This clumsy political jousting between these two giants during the crisis is regrettable but understandable when viewed through the lens of their domestic political challenges. The Chinese political regime underwent a period of great stress during the mishandling of the outbreak, so it was eager to shift focus away from this as quickly as possible. It did so through a vigorous policy response, its propaganda campaign, and by attempting to play a leading role in international efforts. The regime has recovered politically, but it is not out of danger just yet because of the economic slowdown, which has produced the first period of negative economic growth in decades. High economic growth is something that Chinese citizens expect their leadership to deliver. The domestic political challenge for President Donald Trump is severe and getting worse. He does not enjoy the bedrock of a dominant communist party with deep roots in society and the security apparatus to help mitigate threats from political opponents. Instead, he finds himself in the middle of an extremely tough presidential campaign. President Trump's approach has been to distract attention away from his government's dismal performance at home and abroad. And he has done so by any means necessary, including blaming others, such as governors and local officials, and regularly fabricating lies. The worry is that China will not be the only target. There is concern that this president might take extraordinary actions abroad, including military adventures, to risk this summer to distract from the crisis in order to spark a rally around the flag. So even though the world is in uncharted and dangerous waters, there have been important signs of cooperation as well, and we need to mention these. With respect to the United States, for example, most of the attention has gone to the president's poor handling of the crisis and his jousting and fighting with allies and adversaries, with the exception of Vladimir Putin. Less attention is being paid to the critical role of its central bank, the Federal Reserve, that is boldly using its immense powers to cooperate with and support other central banks to provide liquidity to the world economy at a time of extraordinary distress. The Fed can do this because the US is by far the most important vehicle currency in the world. It is backed by the vast wealth of the US economy, its political autonomy, and its deep reservoirs of trust and goodwill that the Fed has earned down through the years. There is, thankfully, also much agreement on what should be done during the crisis, thanks to the lessons learned by the world's central bankers since the crisis of 2008 and 2009, lessons that came after much debate and exchanges of ideas around the world. Less attention is being paid as well to cooperation efforts by non-governmental organizations such as universities, research laboratories, and businesses in efforts to solve problems and provide much needed support during the crisis. So the second argument I propose is that US elections hold an important key to understanding the future direction of the international political order. As I have noted, the crisis is reinforcing political rivalries, particularly between the United States and China, that will be the central contest in global affairs. In the short run, these differences will be exacerbated by their respective efforts to maintain political power and authority at home. This will occur precisely in the months ahead, when the world would stand to benefit with better coordinated pandemic as well as economic policies. Beyond the short run, however, there is some hope that the United States, together with its democratic friends and allies, can begin to better manage their difficult relationship with China that is now being exacerbated by the crisis. It is, however, naive to believe that the West will be accommodating towards China as it has been during the era of hyper-globalization, the period that I mentioned during which China was enabled to grow its economy extremely rapidly. China will naturally continue to grow in its assertiveness and has shown evidence of attempting to play a larger role in international institutions, even while it enhances its security and economic spheres in Asia. However, the democratic world still retains vast resources and advantages with respect to all instruments of power, but these can only be put to use if the West is well led. Obviously, the Trump administration has shown little aptitude for leadership and strategy beyond electoral politics, and it is deeply distrusted by its democratic allies around the world. They can see that this US government is being crassly driven by domestic political priorities, which is to hold the Republican Party in power for another term. With this said, fear and loathing of the US government should not be mistaken for fear and loathing of the United States. Its friends around the world, I think, would be extremely supportive of a new administration led by someone of Joseph Biden's vast experience, political networks, knowledge of global affairs. He is, I think, someone they know who is keen to negotiate and lead fairly during hard times. Clearly, the consequences of the crisis have profound political consequences in democracies, particularly in the way voters perceive the government's capabilities in responding to COVID-19 and to the harsh economic conditions. This will lead to change in governments in either progressive or destructive directions. Whether, I should say, this will lead to change in governments is another matter and will depend on local conditions as well as electoral institutions. People are getting sick and dying, losing friends and loved ones. People are losing their jobs, or they are observing their friends and loved ones losing theirs. The age of hyperglobalization has ended for now and almost certainly won't return to those heights for some time, if ever. In the United States, as people lose their jobs and fall ill, it has become manifestly clear to a majority of middle and poor working class segments of society that their social safety net is stingy and that government policies have disproportionately benefited the wealthy upper middle class and rich segments of the population. However, an important segment of the middle and poor working class in America values other things dearly, such as small government, religion, and racial segregation. These also despise Hollywood and know-it-all professors and intellectuals. They see gun regulations and social safety nets as excessive government intrusion into their personal lives. These intrusions limit their freedom in their view and reward those who lack initiative. This population, mainly but not entirely white Americans, is concentrated in the Deep South, but has over the years spread into the Midwest, rural areas, as well as some suburbs. This population, together with a large proportion of economic elites, form the hardcore base of political support for President Trump and his Republican allies. For President Trump to win re-election, he will need to secure victory in key battleground states in the Midwest, states that voted for Mr. Obama but vetoed Hillary Clinton. Election experts are saying that right now the odds are even, in other words, a flip of the coin. Several factors, however, suggest that the tide might turn against Mr. Trump. First, the coronavirus is now spreading into rural areas, areas that are also feeling the effects of the economic slowdown, areas that are contested electorally. Mass unemployment, particularly in rural areas that have poor infrastructure and job opportunities, would be a political nightmare for any sitting president. It is not surprising that President Trump last week started fanning small pockets of social unrest among those in his base who are protesting in groups for governments to lift sanitary restrictions. Second, the president enjoyed at best a modest uptick in his favorability ratings in polling during a crisis when voters are inclined to rally around their flag as well as their president. This is deeply disturbing for him politically. Third, his support in the Midwest is much softer than it is in the Deep South. Deep Southern states like Alabama, a state where I spent 8 years of my life, people in these states have worldviews with respect to racial segregation, small government, science, and religion that are far more deeply entrenched. President Trump tends to fuel these more extreme sentiments in his party, but in so doing, he will also likely alienate voters in the Midwest who supported him in the last election more out of protest than of conviction. In his favor, President Trump can count on his hardcore political base, high turnout, electoral institutions that overrepresent rural America, voter suppression, vast financial resources, his devoted media mouthpiece, Fox News, and the power of the presidency. He will be at the center of media attention for months. The Russians may even try to help out once again. The electoral battlefield for the US presidency is being prepped now, and its outcome will determine the prospects for cooperation in the world beyond the short run. One can readily envision an international political order if President Trump wins. There has been almost no evidence that he believes in international institutions or in cooperating earnestly with his allies. He has a record of bad-mouthing and undermining them, in fact. His defunding of the World Health Organization is only the latest in a long list of actions that undermine them. He has gone so far as to threaten the hard-won military alliances in Europe and Asia in efforts to get his allies to pay their fair share of security costs, discounting altogether the important benefit that these alliances provide. A President Biden, one can imagine, would almost certainly work to shore up international institutions and American prestige, as well as to restore healthy relations with its most important allies. The world, in short, at this time is rudderless, it's without leadership, and China's instruments of power and prestige are still too vastly limited to take the helm. Its worldview, moreover, is still much too authoritarian for the democratic world to embrace. So let me now turn to a few words by way of conclusion. In the first part of this lecture, I stressed four analytic lenses that I draw upon for analyzing international politics. The first proposition is that states are always striving to increase their power, a combination of military capabilities, economic prosperity, and prestige, or so-called soft power. The second emphasized that this international pursuit of power is constrained by politicians' concern with maintaining and consolidating political power at home. They will at times sacrifice their international pursuits for domestic political priorities. And I think we've seen evidence of this both with respect to China and the United States during the crisis. Third, I stressed that formal and informal international institutions constrain the raw struggle for power between states. Finally, I stressed that states today are highly risk-averse to engage in interstate wars. So with this backdrop in mind, I presented two arguments. The first emphasized that the crisis we are living right now will reinforce the major geopolitical rivalries that exist in the world. I emphasized in particular the struggle between the US and China, a rivalry that is going to be with us for quite some time. I also posited that the results of the US election is a critical juncture, not only for the United States, but for the world. 4 more years of President Trump would leave the world rudderless at a time when international coordination and cooperation are desperately needed to get through this crisis as safely as possible. A well-led United States, with its vast arsenal of military power, wealth, and prestige, would be welcomed by the international community, and most of all by its democratic allies. Just this weekend, some excellent reporting in the New York Times revealed very disturbing news that ties together the thrust of what I have been arguing. The bottom line is that the Republican Party is planning to blame and scapegoat China as part of their core messaging during the re-election campaign. Polling is leading them to believe that this may be a very fruitful tactic for winning what promises to be a difficult election. The idea, of course, is to distract attention away from policy mismanagement by the president, both with respect to the economy as well as the pandemic. Already, the Times reports, senators in difficult races are preparing attack commercials blaming China. Naturally, they will attempt to portray former Vice President Biden as soft on China, a China appeaser, if you will. They believe that this message will stir not only their hard political base, but their softer bases in the Midwest and rural areas as well, through this sort of scaremongering. Couple this development with widespread reporting that the Chinese government is also attempting to stir nationalism by scapegoating the United States. There is a strong likelihood that the Chinese government will not resist taking the attacks made in the US campaign, and that it will respond to strengthen its own political base in kind. The upshot is that in the next few months, we might, just might, see the domestic political bases in both countries harden the discord between China and the United States. This scenario, if it plays out, will reveal quite clearly how domestic political priorities are shaping the parameters for US-China competition in the future. In this case, it would complicate further international cooperation at a time when it is badly needed. To wrap up, I want to reiterate that reflecting on worst-case scenarios of this crisis is not conducive to good health. Such reflecting can take one to very dark places in modern history. Some cannot resist in making somewhat careless comparisons with the 1930s, when a sustained economic collapse led countries to turn inward and wall off their economies. There was, during that period, a dreadful lack of international cooperation by states to try and resolve the crisis collectively. It was fueled by deep mistrust stemming from recent memories of World War I, as well as nationalism. During those years, government efforts to resolve problems worsened the economic crisis. Social unrest became violent and dictators rose to power under the guise of fascism and socialism. That story ended in a genocidal world war. I am cautiously optimistic with respect to the contemporary international political order that is now in deep crisis. Yes, there are huge challenges ahead, but this world is different, and it is worth contrasting it, however superficially, with that of the 1930s. First, comparatively speaking, countries around the world today have much more active states than those in the 1930s, and most have tended to develop more robust social safety nets. There were practically none during the Great Depression of the 1930s, and this sparked social unrest. Second, many governments understand much better today the importance of countercyclical fiscal and monetary policy. More importantly, they are practicing it and will likely continue to do so as the crisis plays out. Governments during the 1930s never quite figured this out, although they experimented as they went, and did so with varying degrees of success. Third, today's world possesses a host of international institutions that support political and economic cooperation, particularly among democratic states, as I have argued. The 1930s had very few by comparison. Finally, the world today is populated with far more high-functioning and wealthy democracies than in the 1930s. This should be conducive to more international cooperation than can be imagined for the 1930s, such as it was. At that time, there were actually relatively few democracies, and many of those went down amidst the crisis. The great worry today, of course, is that the crisis will produce unmanageable levels of social unrest and will wind up setting the stage for the rise of populist dictators who will violently erode democratic governance and with it, the prospect for international cooperation. This final point allows me to circle back and underscore why I believe the forthcoming election in the US is so crucial. As I have stressed, the US has vast reservoirs of military might, economic power, and prestige that could help shore up international cooperation during these dangerous times. And it will almost certainly fail to do so if President Trump is reelected.